She sat in the back corner of the classroom, her head bowed, her pen silently moving across the page. To everyone else, she was invisible, a quiet, unremarkable girl who barely spoke. But to the strict and overbearing teacher, she was a target. "Miss Patel, maybe if you spoke as much as you daydreamed, you wouldn't embarrass yourself in front of the class," the teacher snapped, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The class erupted into laughter, and the girl shrank further into her seat. What no one realized, especially the teacher, was that this quiet girl was hiding a brilliance that would soon humble everyone in the room. When the truth came out, it wouldn't just shock the teacher, it would change everything. Before we jump into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you love powerful stories of justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's get started. From the moment she stepped into the classroom, Meera was an enigma. She never sought attention, never raised her hand, and never challenged anyone, not even when she was ridiculed. Her silence was her shield, her way of navigating a world that often felt too loud, too judgmental. Her long black hair fell like a curtain over her face as if to hide her sharp eyes that scanned everything. Beneath the quiet demeanor was a mind that absorbed knowledge like a sponge, but no one cared to notice. To her classmates, she was the weird, quiet girl. To Mrs. Sharma, the notoriously strict teacher, she was the perfect punching bag. "Meera, if you're too afraid to participate, why are you even here?" Mrs. Sharma would sneer, her voice laced with disdain. Every time she called on Meera, it wasn't to encourage, it was to belittle. And every time Meera would look down, clutch her notebook tighter, and say nothing. What they didn't know, what no one could see, was that Meera wasn't just quiet. She was calculating, observing, waiting. "Meera, are you even paying attention? Or are you lost in your little fantasy world again?" Mrs. Sharma's sharp voice sliced through the classroom like a whip. The students stifled giggles, their eyes darting between the teacher and the girl who sat frozen in her seat. "Yes, ma'am," Meera murmured, barely audible, but Mrs. Sharma wasn't satisfied. "Then explain this equation," she demanded, scribbling an intricate problem on the board. She crossed her arms, her expression smug, as if already anticipating Meera's failure. Meera hesitated, her lips trembling as she glanced at the problem. The silence in the room stretched, suffocating her. "Well, nothing to say?" Mrs. Sharma's voice dripped with mockery. "You can't just sit there in life and hope someone will do the thinking for you." The class erupted into laughter, and Meera's cheeks burned with humiliation. What they didn't see was the faint twitch in her hand, her fingers tracing the solution in the air as her mind worked faster than anyone could imagine. But Mrs. Sharma didn't stop there. She began singling Meera out during every lesson, turning even minor mistakes into public spectacles. When group projects were assigned, Meera was deliberately placed with students who openly dismissed her contributions. "Just stay out of the way," one boy scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You'll only mess things up." And through it all, Meera stayed silent, absorbing every word, every insult, every unfair punishment. No one realized they weren't breaking her. They were fueling her. But as the days passed, something began to change. The tension in Meera's chest, the constant sting of injustice, began to turn into quiet determination. She would sit in the back, her eyes narrowing not out of fear, but focus. They couldn't see it, how her mind was constantly working, dissecting every lesson, every mistake, every piece of knowledge. It was late one evening when Mrs. Sharma announced the upcoming school-wide quiz competition, a challenge that would test the students on everything they had learned that year. Mrs. Sharma's eyes gleamed with excitement as she casually dismissed Meera. "I'm sure you won't be joining, Meera," she said with a sneer. "You're better off just watching this time. You know, to avoid embarrassing yourself again." The room went silent. Meera's heart pounded, but she said nothing. Her classmates whispered, already writing her off as a non-factor in the competition. Yet, as the days drew closer to the quiz, Meera found herself preparing in secret. Late nights, in the stillness of her room, she pored over textbooks, took notes on everything Mrs. Sharma had overlooked, and solved problems no one thought she could. Her true talent, hidden beneath layers of quietude, was starting to emerge. They had underestimated her, but the time for silence was over. The day of the quiz arrived, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. Mrs. Sharma's usual smugness was now laced with the anticipation of her victory. As the students filed into the auditorium, she made sure to give Meera one last condescending look. "You'll be fine sitting this one out," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. But Meera didn't flinch. Instead, she sat in her seat, her hands steady, her face a mask of calm determination. The quiz began, and it wasn't long before the class realized something strange. The questions, usually difficult for most, seemed to flow effortlessly for Meera. Every answer was quick, precise, and most of all, accurate. She solved complex equations with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering them. At first, no one noticed, but when she got the highest score on the first round, higher than the top students, higher than even the teacher's expectations, the whispers began. "How is she doing this?" one student muttered, glancing nervously at Meera. Mrs. Sharma, visibly shaken, tried to brush it off, but the unease in her eyes was undeniable. Every round, Meera surged ahead, taking on problems that left others stumped. Something wasn't adding up. Mrs. Sharma began to feel the heat of her own growing doubt, but she couldn't stop the game now. What was Meera hiding? And why was she suddenly excelling in ways no one could explain? As the final round approached, all eyes were on Meera. She had proven everyone wrong, but now the real test was just about to begin. The final round of the quiz was upon them, and the tension was palpable. Mrs. Sharma stood at the front, trying to keep her composure, but her grip on the marker tightened as she looked at Meera's flawless score. With every correct answer, the disbelief on her face grew. Then came the last question, a problem so complicated it was known to stump even the brightest students. Mrs. Sharma barely concealed her smirk as she wrote it on the board, convinced that this would be the moment Meera finally faltered. "Let's see if you can solve this, Miss Patel," Mrs. Sharma said, her voice almost mocking. "This is above your level, but go ahead, surprise me." The classroom fell into a tense silence as Meera stood, her mind already calculating the solution. The problem, a web of numbers and formulas, twisted around in her head, but to her it was just another puzzle. Her fingers moved quickly across the paper, and in less than a minute, she wrote down the final answer. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Mrs. Sharma, expecting failure, slowly approached the desk to check the answer. Her eyes scanned the page, then widened in disbelief. Meera had solved it, correctly. Not only had she answered the final question, but she had done so in a way that left even the most experienced teachers in awe. What? How? Mrs. Sharma's voice cracked as the realization hit her. Meera wasn't just quiet, she was a genius. The teacher stood there stunned as the students whispered in shock. The quiet girl they had all written off had just outsmarted everyone. What they didn't know was that Meera had been playing a game she was always destined to win. The truth was out now, and it wasn't just a victory for Meera. It was a lesson in humility for everyone who had underestimated her. As the final bell rang, Meera walked out of the auditorium, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with pride. The weight of the years spent in silence, in the shadows of judgment, had finally been lifted. Her classmates, once dismissive, now watched her with a mix of awe and regret. Mrs. Sharma, still standing at the front, could barely meet her gaze. The teacher had been humbled, but Meera had not come here to seek revenge. Her victory wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about proving something to herself. She had always known her worth, even when the world refused to see it. As Meera walked through the hallways, she heard the whispers of her classmates. "She's incredible. I never knew. How did she do it?" But she didn't need their approval anymore. What mattered was that she had found her voice, her power. And as the story came to a close, it wasn't just Meera who had learned a lesson. The message was clear. Never judge someone by their quietness, their appearance, or their silence. The true strength of a person lies beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to shine. In the end, it wasn't about being loud. It was about being true to oneself. And for Meera, that truth had set her free. Thank you for watching. Maya's story reminds us that standing up for what's right can create lasting change. Whether it's overcoming adversity or challenging injustice, your voice matters. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts on the story. Let's keep this conversation going. And remember, sharing these stories helps spread the message of justice and fairness, one act of courage at a time. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.